The year was 1945, and Germany was a country bleeding out in slow motion. The Reich that once boasted it would last 1,000 years now lay cracked and hollow, its cities reduced to rubble piles and silent shells. Roofless houses stared at the sky like broken teeth. Bridges lay collapsed into rivers that reflected only smoke. The war was ending, not with a thunderous finale but with a long, gasping collapse. Yet endings have their own cruelties. Hunger sharpened every breath, and fear clung to every street corner like mist. Spring arrived reluctantly as if ashamed to touch the ruins. Bomb craters filled with rainwater and weeds. Railroads stood twisted and abandoned, steel rails curling like blackened ribbons. Refugees trudged along highways that had once carried Hitler's armies, now nothing more than cracked asphalt under feet worn raw. Soldiers, those who still survived, no longer marched with pride but limped homeward in ragged boots. And among the chaos were those forgotten by nearly everyone. Women in faded gray and blue uniforms, the auxiliaries and clerks, the Red Cross nurses, the radio operators. They had served the machine but not the front lines, and now the machine had died, leaving them behind like discarded cogs. One such group lingered in a makeshift holding enclosure near a village that had no name worth remembering, somewhere between the retreating Wehrmacht and the advancing Americans. It had once been a schoolyard. Now the chalkboards were broken and the windows gaped empty. The wire fencing was haphazard, strung from scavenged posts by men who no longer had orders worth following. Beyond the fence stretched the countryside, orchards stripped bare by scavengers, barns collapsed under the weight of neglect. Inside the enclosure, dozens of women huddled together, their uniforms patched with whatever fabric they'd found, their stomachs empty long enough to have stopped complaining. Among them was Lotte Engel, 21 years old and too thin for her own bones. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the scarf around her neck, a useless defense against the sharp spring wind. Before the war she had been a clerk in Hamburg, typing requisitions for the Luftwaffe and listening to the radio at night with her younger brother. She joined the auxiliary service when the call came, thinking it meant safety. Better to be behind a desk than under the bombs, she had told her mother. That was before Hamburg burned, before her brother vanished on the Eastern Front, before the papers she typed became meaningless. Now Lotte sat on a broken crate with two other women. Anna, a nurse whose face was gaunt but eyes still fiercely alive, and Gerda, a quiet girl of 18 who stared at her boots as if afraid to meet the world's gaze. They had not eaten properly in days. Their captors were few and disinterested, local folkster men who vanished as the front shifted. Rumor said the Americans were close. Rumor also said the Soviets were close. Neither rumor promised safety. The air in the enclosure held a smell no one wanted to name. Sweat, damp straw, sickness. Somewhere, a woman coughed until she nearly collapsed. Anna rose to help her, though there was nothing to give, no medicine, no food, no comfort but a hand on the shoulder. They were prisoners but of whom exactly no one could say. The Nazi authorities were gone. The new masters had not yet arrived. They were suspended in a strange limbo, forgotten between surrender and survival. At night they whispered of what might come. Some feared the Soviets, whose vengeance was already legend. Some feared the Americans less, though none knew for certain. They feed their prisoners, one woman murmured hopefully. They obey rules. But another voice countered, rules break when no one is watching. The uncertainty gnawed almost as fiercely as the hunger. Lotte tried not to think of food, but her body betrayed her with memories. Her mother's Sunday roast, the scent of fresh bread on the street in Hamburg before the war, chocolate once shared in secret with her brother. Now her stomach was hollow and angry, and she pressed her arms around it as if to silence its protest. She wondered if anyone knew they were here. She wondered if anyone cared. Outside the wire, life moved on in fractured ways. Farmers scavenged what little grain they had left. Villagers bartered cigarettes for potatoes. The sky carried the drone of distant planes, though no bombs fell anymore, just the occasional rumble of trucks on the road. One morning those trucks grew louder. The women lifted their heads like startled deer. Dust rose on the horizon, a gray-brown plume curling above the trees. Engines growled, tires crunched over broken stone. For a brief moment, hope sparked and fear flared together. Someone was coming. The guards, such as they were, did nothing. Two of them slipped away entirely, melting into the woods. No one fired a shot. No flags were raised. Only the sound of approaching engines, steady and inevitable. Lotte stood slowly, her legs weak but her curiosity stronger. Anna joined her, squinting toward the road. Even Gerda rose, clutching the fence with pale hands. The convoy emerged like a moving wall of green. American trucks, their white stars dulled by dust, rolled into view. Soldiers sat in the backs, rifles slung, helmets catching the pale sunlight. A jeep led the column, an officer at the wheel. The women pressed closer to the fence, hearts pounding. They were seeing the enemy up close for the first time, not in propaganda cartoons or shouted speeches, but real men, faces shadowed by helmets and days without shaving. They looked tired, wary, but solid in a way that felt alien to the starved, crumbling Germany around them. The truck slowed. Engines idled. Soldiers looked over, surprised perhaps to see a pen full of women where they expected surrendering troops. One man, a tall guard in dusty khaki, swung down from a truck and strode toward the fence. His boots crunched on gravel. His rifle hung easy at his side, but his posture was alert. He stopped a few meters away and stared. For a long moment no one spoke. The women stared back, silent and hollow-eyed. The man's gaze swept over them. The uniforms that no longer fit, the jutting collarbones, the faces pale with more than fear. His expression shifted just slightly, a crease of confusion, then something like anger, though not at them. He said something to another soldier who joined him with a canteen. They exchanged words too low to hear. Lotte's knees trembled. She was suddenly aware of every threadbare patch on her jacket, of how small she must look. She wanted to be invisible and yet desperately wanted him to see her. She thought of her mother again, of the brother who would never come home, of the absurdity that her survival might depend on the stranger beyond the wire. Anna broke the silence first, calling out in hesitant English, "Water?" Her voice cracked. The tall guard blinked, startled. Then he stepped closer, studying the group. He didn't move with the hostility they had feared, nor the indifference they had known. He looked human. His eyes met Anna's, then Lotte's, and lingered there just long enough for her to feel both seen and suddenly fragile. He turned back to his comrades, speaking more urgently now. One of them nodded and hurried toward the trucks. The tall guard remained, his gaze still locked on the huddled women. Something in his jaw tightened, a muscle twitching as if with an unspoken decision. The air between the fence and the convoy seemed to shift, heavy with anticipation. Lotte felt it, an invisible line about to break. In that suspended heartbeat, the world outside the wire finally noticed the world within. Hunger met conscience. Defeat met duty. And as the tall American soldier stepped forward, lips parting to speak, every starving woman held her breath, sensing that whatever he was about to say would decide whether they were forgotten casualties or something more. The tall American stood still for a long moment, boots planted in the gray dust, as if taking measure not just of the scene but of what it demanded from him. His name was Sergeant James Harlow, 24 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had crossed an ocean to fight a war he'd been too young to understand when it began. In letters home he told his mother he was fine, though the shadows in his eyes told a truer story. He had seen bodies in France, mud soaked with more than rain, towns leveled into silence. He thought nothing could surprise him now. But this was different. These were not armed men. These were young women with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to flicker between fear and surrender. He turned slightly and called to the man behind him, Corporal Frank Riley, his closest friend in the unit. Riley was older by a few years and carried his cynicism like a second weapon. "Jesus," Riley muttered when he reached the fence, pushing his helmet back just enough to see better. "They're kids." He whistled softly, a sound of disbelief rather than mockery. Harlow didn't answer. He couldn't take his eyes off the girl in the patched scarf, the one who stood straighter than the rest, though she swayed slightly, as if strength itself was a performance she was determined to keep up. The air was still except for the rumble of idling engines behind them. The other soldiers in the convoy had gone quiet too, watching from a distance. A few exchanged uneasy glances, unsure what this moment required. Officially their orders were simple: secure surrendered areas, process prisoners, move on. Feed them? Clothe them? That wasn't in the manual. And yet, to stand here and see these women, barely alive, abandoned by the system that had used them, made every regulation feel suddenly small. "Water?" the nurse had asked again, her voice cracking on the single word. Harlow unscrewed his own canteen without thinking and passed it through the wire. She grasped it with shaking hands, lifted it to her lips and drank too fast. A cough racked her chest, but she didn't let go. The others stared, some stepping forward timidly as if fearing a trick. When she handed the canteen back, her eyes glistened with tears she didn't dare shed. "More?" Harlow said quietly over his shoulder. Riley hesitated. "We don't know who they are," he warned. "Could be Nazis same as the rest." But even as he said it, his tone lacked conviction. These didn't look like zealots or officers. They looked like secretaries and medics, girls who had believed safety lay behind a typewriter or a Red Cross band. More, Harlow repeated louder now, and Riley jogged back to the trucks. He returned with another canteen and a battered tin of army biscuits. The smell of even that dry, unremarkable food seemed to ripple through the crowd behind the fence. The women surged forward before catching themselves, restrained by fatigue and caution. Harlow passed the tin through, breaking the biscuits into smaller pieces so more hands could take them. A faint murmur rose, soft thanks in German, a few tears, a kind of disbelief more than gratitude. The girl with the scarf, Lotte, took her portion with trembling fingers. For an instant her eyes met Harlow's through the rough wire. Something unspoken passed there, not romance but recognition. The raw human acknowledgement of one person saving another in a world that had done little saving. She lowered her gaze quickly, ashamed of her own hunger and of needing help from the uniform she'd once been taught to fear. Behind Harlow, Riley shook his head. "You know command's gonna chew us out if they think we're wasting rations on them," he muttered. Harlow didn't answer. Something in him had shifted the moment he saw those faces. He thought of his sister back in Iowa, barely younger than these women, working long hours in a factory and writing letters that smelled faintly of home. He thought of the promises soldiers made to themselves, that they would hold on to decency, that war wouldn't take everything. Here was a test of that promise. He stepped back and surveyed the enclosure. "How long you think they've been here?" he asked quietly. Riley shrugged. "Judging by the bones? Too long." He spat into the dust, anger simmering under the dry gesture. "Nobody's watching. Nobody cares." Harlow's jaw tightened. That, he thought, was the problem. Nobody was watching. Nobody cared. Which meant somebody had to. He turned to the nearest private, a kid named Alvarez, barely 19 and still green enough to flinch at every sudden noise. "Get Lieutenant Price," Harlow ordered. Alvarez blinked but obeyed, jogging off toward the jeep where their commanding officer sat scanning maps. Price arrived a few minutes later, irritation in his stride. "What's the hold-up, Sergeant?" he asked, voice clipped, eyes flicking over the scene without much interest. Harlow didn't salute. "Sir, these are POWs. Women. They've got nothing. No food, no water. Some won't last another day." Price frowned. "Our orders are to move on to the depot at Bremen. We're stretched thin as it is. Locals will have to handle it." "With what?" Harlow shot back before he could stop himself. "There's no locals left here who can feed them. Look at them, sir. They're starving." Price sighed, the sound of a man exhausted by months of war and red tape. "Sergeant, I sympathize. But we're not a relief mission." Harlow glanced back at the fence. Lotte was still standing, though now leaning against the post for balance. Anna knelt beside a woman who had collapsed quietly in the dirt, fanning her with her hand. Gerda clung to the wire, staring at the Americans like someone watching a door slowly closing. Harlow turned back. "With respect, sir, we should be." For a moment, silence. Price studied him, a trace of something, annoyance, maybe admiration, passing through his eyes. Finally, he rubbed a hand across his jaw. "Damn it, Harlow. You'll get us written up." "Then write me up," Harlow said. His voice didn't rise, but it carried steel. "They're coming with us." Riley exhaled sharply, half a laugh of disbelief, half a sigh of relief. Price swore under his breath, then finally nodded. "Fine. Load him in the last truck. But if we run short before Bremen, it's on you." Harlow didn't smile, but something loosened in his chest. He turned to the women and motioned with a careful gesture, open, non-threatening. Some of them hesitated, unsure if this was salvation or another relocation to nowhere. Anna translated in halting English and German, "They take us." The words seemed too simple for the weight they carried. Slowly, with a mix of hope and terror, the women began to move. Lotte's legs wobbled as she stepped forward. The ground beyond the fence felt unreal beneath her feet, like she was crossing into another life. Riley opened the truck's tailgate and offered his hand to help them up. Some refused the touch out of pride. Others clutched it gratefully. Harlow stood by, making sure no one was left behind, counting heads, though he'd lost count of why it mattered, only that it did. As the last climbed aboard, Harlow noticed the one who had collapsed. Anna was helping her, but the woman could barely walk. Without thinking, he stepped forward, stooped, and lifted her carefully into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. For a moment, as he carried her toward the truck, the convoy went silent except for the soft creak of his boots. A soldier carrying an enemy? No, not an enemy. Just a human being. When he set her down on the truck bed, Anna whispered a choked "Danke." Lotte watched the act, her eyes wide. Something inside her, a cold, hard knot forged by years of propaganda and fear, shifted just slightly. The enemy had a face, and that face looked tired, kind, and unbearably young. Price gave the order to move out. Engines roared to life. The trucks lurched forward, heading toward the nearest supply depot where there might be food and medical care. Inside the last truck, the women huddled together, swaying with the motion. Some wept softly. Some sat silent, stunned. Lotte stared at her hands, still holding the dry biscuit Harlow had given her, as if afraid it might vanish. Harlow rode in the back with them, against regulations but unwilling to leave them alone. Riley leaned against the tailgate, smoking in silence. For miles they traveled through a land of broken farms and silent towns. The women whispered to each other in German, sharing fragments of hope. Anna leaned toward Harlow at one point and said in halting English, "You, good man." He shook his head slightly. "Just doing what's right." But even as he said it, he knew it was more than that. It was a small rebellion against a war that had taken too much humanity from everyone. As the sun dipped low and painted the ruined countryside gold, the truck jolted over a pothole. Lotte glanced at Harlow and for the first time, dared a small, fragile smile. He met it with a nod, nothing more, but the exchange was enough. In that quiet space between strangers once taught to hate each other, something human survived. The convoy crested a hill, revealing the distant silhouette of an American supply base against the darkening sky. Relief should have felt certain, but the war's shadow lingered long and deep. None of them knew what waited ahead. Orders could change, rations could run out, mercy could meet bureaucracy and falter. Yet for the first time in days, perhaps weeks, the women felt movement that wasn't despair. And as the headlights swept the road ahead, Sergeant James Harlow tightened his grip on his rifle, not in threat but in silent promise, that this small act of compassion would hold, no matter what waited at the next turn. The road to the American supply base wound through a countryside still trembling from defeat. Farmhouses leaned in broken silence, their roofs patched with scavenged timber. Fields once sown with barley lay unplanted, churned by tanks and shellfire. Hunger clung to the air as tangibly as the smoke from distant chimneys. In the back of the truck, Lotte sat pressed between Anna and Gerda, each jolt rattling their starved bodies. The simple motion of travel, forward, purposeful, felt alien after so many stagnant days behind wire. She clutched the edge of the wooden bench with pale fingers and tried to steady herself, though her strength felt like a borrowed thing. Across from her sat Sergeant James Harlow, boots planted, hands resting loosely on his rifle. He wasn't watching them with suspicion. His eyes moved from face to face with quiet calculation, as if taking inventory of lives he had unexpectedly become responsible for. Lotte avoided his gaze, though she felt it occasionally land on her, heavy but not cruel. Anna, braver, met his eyes once, nodded in gratitude, and looked away before tears could betray her. Gerda kept her head down entirely, a small figure swallowed by fatigue. The truck's engine droned on, a steady lifeline through a land of scarcity. The women could smell the soldiers' rations when the wind shifted. Canned meat, coffee grounds, tobacco. It was a scent almost painful in its richness. Lotte's stomach nodded and gurgled, and she pressed her hands over it, ashamed. War had reduced dignity to the simplest hungers. Harlow noticed. Without a word, he reached into his pack and produced a small chocolate bar, its wrapper crinkling. The movement drew every pair of eyes. He hesitated, perhaps aware of how little he had and how many needed. Then he snapped the bar into rough pieces, passed them one by one down the bench. No one moved at first, unsure if accepting would break some unspoken rule. Then Anna took a piece, whispered, "Danky," and the spell broke. Lotte accepted hers with shaking hands, staring at the dark square of sweetness as if it were treasure. When she bit into it, the taste overwhelmed her, rich, bitter, and almost unbearably good. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and sudden. She wiped them away before anyone could see. Harlow said nothing, but the faintest smile tugged at his mouth. Riley, perched near the tailgate, muttered, "You're gonna spoil him, Jim," but there was no bite in it. The moment passed without ceremony, yet its weight lingered. For the women it was proof that kindness still existed. For Harlow, it was a quiet rebellion against the endless instructions to remain detached. The convoy stopped briefly at a crossroads, engines idling as officers conferred. From where they sat, the women could see a cluster of displaced civilians trudging along the verge. Mothers with children, old men pushing carts, people wearing everything they owned. Their faces were hollow masks of exhaustion. One boy no older than 12 waved tentatively at the Americans. When no one waved back, his arm dropped. Latte watched him disappear into the dusk and felt the distance between the powerful and the powerless stretch like an unbridgeable gulf. She wondered if, before the war, the Americans had felt like this, so sure of movement and fuel and food while others stood stranded. Anna shifted beside her and whispered in German, "We are ghosts." Latte frowned. Anna clarified, softer, "Between worlds. Not Nazis. Not free. Not dead." Her tone carried neither bitterness nor hope, only weary truth. Latte wanted to answer but found no words. She glanced instead at Harlow, wondering if he understood. They reached the supply base at nightfall. Floodlights illuminated low barracks and lines of stacked crates. The air smelled of diesel and boiled coffee. American soldiers moved with brisk efficiency, their laughter occasional but muted, the sound of men too tired to celebrate. As the trucks rolled in, a sergeant from the quartermaster corps approached, clipboard in hand. His expression tightened when he saw the extra passengers. "Refugees?" he asked curtly. "POWs," Harlow answered. "Starving." The man sighed, scanning his paperwork. "We've got barely enough for our own men. Orders are to move excess civilians to local camps." "Local camps don't exist," Harlow said. "They'll die." A tense beat hung between them. The quartermaster studied the women, thin, silent, shivering under his scrutiny. He seemed to wrestle with something, duty against decency, scarcity against survival. Finally, he nodded toward a low hut near the edge of the compound. "There's room there. I can spare rations tonight. After that, it's up to command." It was not salvation, but it was something. Harlow gestured for the women to dismount. Some stumbled as their weak legs hit solid ground. Soldiers nearby watched with guarded curiosity, some pitying, some indifferent. Anna helped the collapsed woman, now awake but barely conscious, while Harlow moved beside her in case she fell. Gerda clutched Latte's sleeve like a child. Inside the hut, the air was warmer and smelled faintly of bread. Wooden bunks lined the walls. A young medic arrived with bandages and thin blankets. The sight of food, real food, steaming from a field kitchen, drew stunned silence. When bowls of thin stew were placed before them, a few women began to cry quietly. Latte held her spoon in trembling hands, afraid the moment might shatter if she moved too quickly. When she tasted the broth, salty, hot, alive, it was almost too much to bear. Across the room, Harlow leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. He kept watch, though no threat lingered. His presence felt like a silent assurance. "You are safe at least for tonight." Riley joined him, shaking his head. "You're a damn fool," he said softly. "But maybe a good one." "They're people," Harlow replied simply. "They were the enemy," Riley countered, though without conviction. "War's over," Harlow said. "Someone has to remember what that means." Later, as the women settled onto bunks, Latte lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling. The sounds around her, soft breathing and occasional cough, the distant rumble of generators, were strangely comforting after days of fear. Yet sleep didn't come. She kept seeing Harlow's face when he defied his orders, when he carried the fainted woman, when he handed her that shard of chocolate. It unsettled her, not attraction but the sudden collapse of an entire belief system. She had been raised to think of Americans as monsters. But monsters didn't give chocolate. Monsters didn't argue with their own officers to save lives. If that was false, what else had been? Anna whispered from the bunk below. "You're awake?" "Yes," Latte whispered back. "Tomorrow?" Anna asked, the single word heavy with dread and hope. "I don't know," Latte said. And she didn't. Would they be moved again? Fed again? Forgotten? She thought of home, though she wasn't sure it existed anymore. She thought of her mother's kitchen, likely bombed to rubble. Of her brother's empty bed. Of everything the war had stolen and the strange, reluctant kindness now being offered by those she had feared. Outside, Harlow stood smoking in the cool night. He stared at the horizon, where darkness hid a broken continent. He knew his small act of mercy might drown in orders and shortages come morning. Yet he also knew it mattered, maybe not to headquarters, but to the hollow-eyed faces now resting behind him. It was the first thing in months that felt right. A soft noise behind him made him turn. Latte had stepped just outside the hut, blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. She didn't approach fully, keeping a respectful distance. For a moment they only looked at each other, enemy and liberator, neither quite fitting the titles anymore. Then, in halting English, she said, "Thank you." Harlow inclined his head. "You're welcome." His voice was quiet but firm, as if anchoring something fragile. She seemed about to say more, but no words came. Instead she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and retreated back into the hut. Harlow watched her go, exhaling smoke into the night, wondering what tomorrow would demand of both of them. Morning would bring new orders, new scarcity, new tests of conscience. But tonight, in the fragile stillness after so much hunger and fear, a single truth lingered. Humanity had not yet starved to death. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the fences and the floodlights, the war still waited to see if mercy could survive it. Morning arrived pale and cold, the kind of light that reveals everything without warmth. The women stirred slowly on their bunks, reluctant to leave the fragile safety of the night. Outside, trucks rumbled and boots crunched as the base woke to another day of uncertain peace. For the first time in weeks, Lotte awoke with strength enough to sit upright. Her body still felt light and weak, but the simple act of standing was no longer a battle. Anna smiled faintly when their eyes met. Gerda still slept curled like a child, one hand gripping her blanket as if it might be taken away. Sergeant James Harlow was already awake, leaning against a jeep with a mug of black coffee. His uniform looked rumpled, his eyes shadowed by too little sleep and too much thinking. He had spent most of the night writing a report for his commanding officer, arguing, again, that the women should be kept safe, fed, and eventually released humanely. Paperwork felt absurd after carrying starving strangers to safety, but it was the only weapon he had now. The war had ended in gunfire. Peace, he was learning, would be a war of memos and signatures. Orders came down mid-morning. The women were to be transferred to an official displaced persons camp farther west, where German civilians, freed forced laborers, and former POWs were being sorted and processed. It was not perfect. Conditions there were rough, food scarce. But it was better than being abandoned in the wreckage. Harlow read the orders twice, jaw tightening. The system was finally acknowledging what he had seen with his own eyes. A small victory, though it didn't feel like one. When he entered the hut to tell them, silence swept through the room. Dozens of wary eyes fixed on him. Lotte stood instinctively, bracing herself as if for bad news. Harlow spoke slowly, choosing words simple enough for those who understood only scraps of English. You will go west. A camp. Food. Shelter. Safer. He paused, searching their faces for signs of fear. It is not prison. It is safety. For now. Anna translated quietly into German. Murmurs rippled. Some women sighed in relief, some looked doubtful. One older nurse asked a sharp question. Anna replied softly, and the woman's shoulders sank with reluctant acceptance. Lotte said nothing, but her eyes never left Harlow's face. She searched it for deceit and found none. When the trucks came, the women climbed aboard more steadily than before. They were still thin, still bruised by hunger, but no longer fragile shadows. They were survivors. Lotte helped Gerda into the bed of the truck and then paused, looking back at the hut where they had found warmth for the first time in days. She saw Harlow standing there, speaking with Lieutenant Price, who seemed impatient to move on. Price barked something she didn't catch, but Harlow only nodded and glanced toward the truck. His gaze met hers across the distance. Brief, unsentimental, but real. The convoy rolled out under a sullen sky. This time Harlow did not ride with them. Duty had shifted. His unit was moving to secure another sector. Lotte sat near the edge, watching him shrink in the distance until he was only a khaki figure against gray mud. She didn't wave. Somehow a wave felt too simple for what had passed between them. But she held the moment deep inside, like the memory of chocolate on a starving tongue. The road west was long. Villages passed in ruins, bridges were little more than planks. Yet the trucks did not stop and the women did not collapse. They endured, sustained by the knowledge that someone had chosen not to look away. At the camp, things were as promised. Tents, thin rations, chaotic lines of paperwork. It was far from comfort, but it was life. Many would rebuild from there, some returning home to shattered families, some never finding home again. Lotte stayed for weeks, helping as she could, writing lists for camp officials, translating when other women faltered. The work gave her a purpose beyond survival. She thought often of Harlow. She wondered if he had made it home to Iowa, if he had told his mother about the starving girls he fed and sheltered. She wondered if he even remembered her face. Yet she understood something vital. Remembrance was not the point. He had not acted for gratitude or for history. He had acted because war takes enough without taking one's humanity. That small defiance was its own victory. Years later, Lotte would tell her children about the war with careful honesty. She did not speak much of ideology or leaders. She spoke of hunger, of fear, of how easily people could vanish when no one cared. And she told them once about an American soldier who broke the rules to save strangers. She did not remember his rank exactly, or the precise color of his eyes, but she remembered the weight of the chocolate in her hand and the quiet strength in his voice. That day, she would say softly, I stopped believing that kindness belonged only to one side. For Harlow, the war ended not on the day of surrender but in the moment he saw those women and chose to act. He returned to Iowa carrying memories he rarely shared, ruined cities, fallen friends, and one small truckload of lives pulled back from the edge. When asked years later if war changed him, he would answer with a long silence, then say only, "It tries to." He never elaborated, but sometimes his eyes softened when he heard German spoken in the streets of new immigrants. Sometimes he would hand a child a piece of candy without explanation. The guns had fallen silent, but their echo lingered in every ruined home, every camp of displaced souls. Mercy was fragile in those days, too easily drowned in revenge or bureaucracy. Yet here and there, someone chose it anyway. One sergeant's decision had not ended hunger or rebuilt cities. But for a handful of forgotten women, it had drawn a line between despair and survival. For Lotte, it meant the difference between dying unseen and living to rebuild a life. On the last night before the women left the camp for the fractured world beyond, Lotte sat by a small fire with Anna and Gerda. They spoke of futures they could barely imagine, family, work, perhaps love. When the fire died down to embers, they fell quiet, listening to the distant murmur of other refugees and the wind in the dark trees. Somewhere far away, trains rumbled, carrying soldiers home. Lotte thought of the man who had refused to look away, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something close to hope. War had tried to starve not just her body but her belief in people. Yet one quiet act, defiant and unrecorded, had broken through. She would carry that forward. The night was cold, but she did not pull her blanket tighter. Instead she closed her eyes and let the memory of that voice return. Not a grand speech, not a command from history, just a simple promise whispered into a ruined world. You're coming with me.